Dr. Jeffrey Barnett, thank you so much for joining us. For those who don't know, you're an eminent expert in ethical and legal matters pertaining to these topics.
Thanks. So I believe that we all use different forms of technology in our professional work. And it's very common to integrate technology into practice. So we all do it. So when we think in terms of telemental health, it can seem like something different and perhaps even something daunting, like, what's that all about? I don't know how to do that. But we all integrate different types of technology into our practices regularly. So if a clinician has a client who has an emergency or crisis between in-person sessions and they do a phone session, or you have a client who goes on vacation or business travel and you need to do a phone session, that's telemental health. So really, everyone does telemental health. People might think, well, but there's other forms of telemental health, other aspects to it, and that's true, and we can talk about those as well. But in terms of the ethics, legal, and clinical aspects of it, I think all three of those have to always be considered and thought about. So, I don't want to just focus on one of those or two. It's really ethical, legal, and clinical. These technologies, I mentioned telephone, but many clinicians might use email or text messaging, participate in video conferencing of some sort. You and I are using a video conferencing platform called Zoom right now. And just as we're having this interaction, you could be providing me with clinical supervision right now using this technology. So it's widely available and regularly used. And then beyond the types of technology I've mentioned so far, there's also the use of apps and these applications that are available and easily downloaded, as well as the use of social media or social networking. And each of these can be relevant. And I know the main topic here is the use of technology or telemental health for supervision, but we also have to keep in mind that they might be used in the provision of clinical services. Everything that I'm doing as a supervisor with my supervisee, I'm modeling, I'm a professional role model. We all are as supervisors for our supervisees, and they're going to see how do we interact with them using technology? How do we use the technology appropriately or inappropriately? How do we address ethical and legal issues and dilemmas that come up? And they'll then perhaps be using these technologies in the treatment of their clients. I think it's vital to understand that there's a big difference between the use of telemental health for the total provision of clinical services versus having in-person treatment or services and using the technology to fill in. Again, I think we all do that to some extent. As far as main ethics and clinical topics regarding the use of technology as supervisors, I think the first step is really being familiar with the literature. There's a lot of research on the use of telemental health for different types of treatment, using different treatment techniques for different presenting problems and disorders. And we just have to be familiar with that, and it's rapidly evolving. One area that I think is important to comment on is the idea of when we interact with others professionally, I draw a distinction between the administrative uses of technology or the administrative uses of telehealth and clinical uses. Mm-hmm. So if I'm interacting with a client or a supervisee by email, and it's just about changing an appointment time or rescheduling, to me that's an administrative use. And I don't really have significant concerns about the impact of doing that or threats to confidentiality and privacy, as an example. Mm-hmm. But when using it for clinical purposes, then the stakes are much higher. And again, that's between me and my supervisee and between my supervisee and their client.
Absolutely. And I think that's a critical point for our population that we're addressing, because I think there might be slippage, that it begins administratively and then slips into clinical, like supervision, like, what should I do? This just happened.
Right. So I can have a client or a supervisee who might periodically communicate for administrative purposes using technology. And as you're saying, it's so easy for that to slip into, oh, well, I have you on the line. Let me just ask you this. Or, they send you this 13-paragraph email at 11 p.m. anticipating, oh, well, sure, they'll just respond right away.
Okay, let's take a few minutes to discuss ways you're using technology, both administratively and clinically. Have there been instances in which those uses of technology started administratively, but then slipped into clinical?
Leads to what I think is a very important point of having these kinds of issues addressed through informed consent.
Yes.
And obviously, in clinical supervision, they typically talk about that as the supervision contract, which I know you're intimately familiar with. Your name is associated with that in the literature. But to address electronic communication policy or use of technology policy that is it's integrated into your informed consent agreement, so that first, everyone knows what you're unwilling to do or not do as a supervisor. Mm-hmm. It can include issues of fees and financial arrangements. So, do I charge for my time if you send me a long, detailed email and expect a response? Because I have to take time to read it and respond. And what is the timeliness of my response that you can anticipate? So letting people know, am I available 24/7 always for you, or here are the limits and boundaries? There's some kind of a mention of an agreement that's reached in the informed consent. And again, the idea of administrative versus clinical uses and appropriateness of use, reasonable expectations, any fees involved, and a wealth of other issues. I know one thing when I was mentioning about the literature before, when using technology for clinical purposes, there's a strong body of literature that indicates or demonstrates that using video conferencing technology, one can establish a therapeutic alliance equivalent to and sometimes superior to in person. But with email and texting, there is absolutely zero evidence of that. Right. I know there are models out there, commercial models for email counseling, and nobody really knows what that service is that's being provided. I understand people are communicating by email and clinical topics or issues are being addressed, but it's not actually counseling or psychotherapy. So one has to be cautious about that.
Yeah, very cautious. I'm wondering, back to the part you said about supervision and the alliance, I'm wondering whether you actually feel confident about that research, because it feels like it's in its infancy, that the alliance is as strong through telesupervision as it is through face-to-face in person, and whether there aren't generational differences, for example, and possibly reactivity or countertransference differences.
Oh, sure. Well, let me just preface this by saying, when using email and texting, there are a number of weaknesses in terms of effective communication. So, for example, visual cues, facial expression, tone of voice, body language, hygiene, how well kept I am dressed, one's accent or way of speaking, tone of voice and rapidity and volume. There's so much you can miss through email and texting. But as you and I right now are interacting with video conferencing, we're able to make eye contact, and I'm able to see you doing nonverbal reinforcers right now of what I'm saying and smiling. And so I feel like this is very close to in-person. The technology has rapidly evolved over the last 5 to 10 years. So 10 years ago, I wouldn't feel as positively or as strongly about it. Okay. Having a good internet connection, ensuring you have the appropriate software that's HIPAA compliant so that we don't have risks to people's confidential information, making sure that we use the technology appropriately. But again, with video conferencing, I view it one way. Email, texting, and phone, very different.
Very helpful. You're talking about informed consent as being a critical piece. Do you want to go ahead and talk about some of the other ethical and legal issues?
Sure. Well, one is competence. One of the things we need to do as supervisors is first have that competence in the use of the technology, but then ensure that our supervisees have that so they can use the technology if they are in counseling or psychotherapy and instruct their clients and the effective use.
You talk a lot about confidentiality also as a next level.
Right. So again, using HIPAA compliant software is vital. So, most people have heard of Skype and regularly use it, but Skype is not HIPAA compliant. There are many HIPAA compliant software video conferencing platforms that are available and that exist. And all one needs to do is just doing an online search, such as through Google, just HIPAA compliant video conferencing, and you get a whole long list. Another thing is PC Magazine is sort of the Consumer Reports of technology. And they have their annual evaluation issues where they do ratings of different types of software and hardware. So I don't want to endorse a particular product because things are evolving and changing all the time. Right. But go do some online research and see what the experts have to say, and then pick the one that works for you. Another thing that, there are numerous things we need to be aware of with use of technology, but for example, we must use a password-protected Wi-Fi connection whenever using or sharing confidential information. So many members of the public use different technology in their lives. Just go to the airport and see how many people are on your device. Go to Starbucks and see how many people are online. But keep in mind, if that's free Wi-Fi, free public access Wi-Fi, it's not protected. Anyone can have access to your information. And just as an aside, if I'm at the airport or Starbucks or wherever, and I'm just on my computer and I'm accessing my bank account, that's really a big problem. So my first recommendation is we as supervisors need to make sure our supervisees know this, and then we have to ensure they make sure their clients know this when they're interacting using any form of technology. Because a client might naturally think, oh, I can just do my session sitting out in front of Starbucks under the umbrella while having my latte. That's a real serious problem. So I have Wi-Fi internet in my home, but it's not always perfect. So what I've done for this interaction today is on my iPhone, I, under settings, went to personal Wi-Fi hotspot, and I've actually created a secure Wi-Fi connection through my phone. And that's actually much better than what I have in my house. That's easy to do. So if I did want to be at Starbucks, I could do that. But then again, there's people walking around, and it's just not a private environment. So instructing our supervisees and instructing our clients about sort of the ground rules of, etiquette, net etiquette they call it, but the appropriate behaviors when using technology.
Let's take a few minutes to discuss any confidentiality issues that have arisen in your work setting related to telemental health. Have there been any, and what did they look like? And what could you imagine as issues that might arise?
Other things, there are so many HIPAA violations that are reported in the media. And typically, these are things like not keeping your virus and firewall protection up to date. So if you get a new phone or a new computer, it has virus and firewall protection built in. But regularly, you get a message of an update that needs to be downloaded. The reason the provider is sending us that update is because they've discovered a flaw, that there are all these bots, these computer programs and humans out there trying to break into systems to get our confidential information, steal our identity and things like that. And so when they discover a flaw, they create a patch, and that's the download. So one of the forms of human error is not keeping all our protections current. So for supervision, do you have an online platform where your supervisee uploads a video of the session? And actually, do you have an electronic health record system where the clinical documentation is uploaded and then you access it? Again, it has to be HIPAA compliant. You have to ensure password protection. It's so easy to just assume what we do in our personal life is sufficient to apply in our professional role. It's different. It's a much higher standard that we have as professionals. We have this fiduciary responsibility that we have to, in every action we take, we have to consider what is in this other person's best interest, whether it's my supervisee or a client.
I think some of the challenges in the group of supervisors we're working with are things like when perhaps a supervisee goes on vacation to another state and yet somehow has a client crisis, or the client goes out of state, or just emergencies and crises in general.
I think that's a big issue for professionals in general. Typically, you must be licensed to independently provide mental health services. And licensure is done by each state's legislature. They pass these laws and they appoint a licensure board, and then they empower that licensure board to develop and promulgate regulations to implement the licensure law. If I'm in a state and I'm providing a service and my client is in that state, it's pretty straightforward. But as you say, what if your client is out of that state in another state or another country, for example? Well, this goes back to my earlier point about the entire treatment or the entire supervision is provided online across a state line, or it's just one session here or there to fill in for a crisis. I can't speak for any licensing board. What I can say is there is no case law or licensure board decision on record to date where a mental health professional who's licensed in one state, who has a client from their state or a supervisee from their state, leaves the state for a period of time, has a crisis, and we do a video conferencing session across state lines or a phone session across state lines, and they take action. There's no record of that ever happening. Providing the entire service to someone who started out in another state viewed differently. And the reason for that is because where I'm located and I'm sending the communication, I'm providing the service from my state, but it's being received in the other state. And that other state's licensure board and perhaps their attorney general will view, well, I'm actually now providing services in a state where I'm not licensed. Most states have a provision for a 30-day temporary practice in their jurisdiction. But to do that, one has to apply for that in writing to the licensure board in that other state. They're typically very good about it, but it can take a lot of time. It could take you a couple of months. So with a crisis, you just need to do what's best for your client.
The only thing is with supervisees, I think it's a little different. If you have a supervisee who's seeing a client and the client's going to the other state periodically or frequently, I don't feel comfortable having that supervisee continue the service extensively. I'm not talking about like one time.
So if it's an ongoing practice, I think it's very risky, both legally and perhaps even clinically. Another point that you're highlighting for me is when someone is in another state, there are other clinical, ethical, legal issues that we need to be aware of, both for us, for our supervisees, and then for their clients. And so just as an example, when we talk about confidentiality and its limits, there are these three major mandatory exceptions to confidentiality. One being the duty to report a reasonable suspicion of abuse or neglect of a minor. Every state has that law. The wording is different state to state. The line you must cross, criteria are different. And then some states have an elder abuse reporting requirement. Others have a vulnerable adult reporting requirement. And then the whole issue of dangerousness and duty to warn, protect, or treat. Some states have just duty to warn, some just duty to protect, some duty to warn and protect, some don't have any of it. And so if I'm in my state and I know my laws and my supervisee knows the laws because I make sure of it, but their client is in a different state, knowing those laws becomes extremely important because we have to make sure our supervisee follows those laws. And then beyond that, when someone is far away from you, and it can be even in the same state, we have to do some advanced research on local resources where the client and where the supervisee are located, even if it's not another state, because what if they're in crisis? What if they need hospitalization? What if they're having a real tremendous interaction side effect of medication or become actively suicidal? You can be in the same state, so licensure is not the issue, but they're 1,100 miles away. We can't say, oh, come in right away, I'll see you in an hour. This gets into clinical issues now. Not every set of presenting problems are amenable to telehealth. And so I think we have to do an initial screening of every single potential client. Are their presenting problems amenable to this medium? And again, if someone who's very high risk, homicidal, suicidal, high impulse control, severe depression, psychosis, potentially needing inpatient treatment or complex medication issues or complex health issues, you have to question of, is this medium appropriate for providing the treatment? And then have I done my research and found out local resources just in case they're needed? Because when the crisis happens, that's not when I want to start doing research.
I'm really conservative. I actually don't let my supervisees do anything across state lines because I don't feel comfortable with it. So
it's for filling in briefly, but not on any kind of regular basis. Right. And I actually have some difficulties with the concept of the entire service being provided online. That creates a whole set of other challenges where you've never actually met in person. I know people do that and they say it's great, but I think that takes it to another level. And I think a reasonable approach is just, again, I do a phone session with someone in crisis in between sessions. That's the kind of use of technology or the kind of telehealth I'm comfortable with. It's primarily in-person supervision, primarily in-person treatment, using the technology to fill in, and then use of email or texting for administrative purposes. When I get a text message of, oh, I'm stuck in traffic, I'll be 5 minutes late, I appreciate that.
Telesupervision, anything else?
With supervision, how one accesses digital recordings, videos to review, how one accesses documentation, and having it all be secure, HIPAA compliant, secure, and password protected. It's nice to be able to, like, if right now, you can do screen sharing with me. So if you had a video uploaded, I could say, play from minute 12 to minute 18. Let's look at that together. Okay, pause here. So what were you thinking when you recommended this? Right. That's amazing. The use of technology like that is great. Anytime we engage or purchase a product or a service from a business that alleges to be HIPAA compliant, they have to provide what's called a business associates agreement, which is basically a letter where they're certifying that this is HIPAA compliant. It's not a 100% foolproof guarantee, but at least you're making your reasonable good faith effort to ensure that it's HIPAA compliant. But again, I can see the use of video conferencing for supervision in that way as very helpful. Group supervision works the same way. You can have a group of people, each one has a password. So again, we're using Zoom right now, and there are 2 boxes. I see you, I see me, but you can have 12 of them, or 14 or 8. So there can be multiple people who are participating, and we all have secure access to the video, the digital recording that was uploaded.
Actually, that's how we conduct our trainings for this program. We have exactly what you
see how ethical and competent you are? This is great. I do want to comment on documentation. I've heard from a number of clinicians and supervisors at times where they somehow think documentation requirements are different or less if you're providing a service electronically. It still needs to be documented. So if I keep notes, a clinical record of the date, the time, who was present, what was the service provided, what did we discuss, what progress was achieved, what recommendations did they make, what follow-up, I still have to keep a record. To me, the standard is supervisors should document the supervision they provide. Supervisees should document the supervision they receive. And then there's the documentation the supervisee creates of the services they provide for their clients. So from my perspective, I recommend 3 pieces of documentation. And the documentation by supervisor and supervisee, I think, can be very helpful for avoiding misunderstandings and confusion. It's very important for accountability. And if ever a complaint is filed, your or our documentation is legally the tangible record of the evidence of your reasonable good faith effort to meet or exceed the standards of your profession. They're not going to ask, what did you do? What were you thinking? How did you decide that? Did you consult? What assessment did you do? What risk assessment? They're going to look at our documentation. Right. And so even as a supervisor, not having documentation if a complaint is filed against your supervisee or against you can be highly problematic. And if ever we need someone to fill in for us, they're going to look at the documentation and they can step right in. If it doesn't exist, they can't help them in that way.
So
let's take a few minutes to discuss documentation. We assume that your agency requires careful and complete documentation of client interactions. But to what extent is documentation required or simply expected with respect to supervision sessions? Or is it at all? And what should it look like at your agency?
helpful. Anything else you feel like is essential?
Oh, there's one other issue that I'll comment on, and this involves the use of apps and social media. Apps can be downloaded easily, and one of the things about apps and social media is many individuals use these in their personal lives. And oftentimes what we use in our personal life will naturally assume can easily be used in our professional lives. And so many of our clients or supervisees who use social media in their lives and who use apps of different sorts in their lives are going to naturally assume, oh, sure, I can use that with my clinician or with my supervisor. And we need to be very clear about boundary, multiple relationship kinds of issues.
Yes.
And, with apps, there are tens of thousands of different apps that exist, all these mental health apps. Some are evidence-based, some are highly effective and useful, some have no benefit, some might even be harmful. So I always recommend that we ask our clients questions about the use of any apps, because they might be using one that's very helpful and you work with them in treatment with it or in supervision, or maybe not. But we need to do our research, study the literature, download the apps ourselves that our clients are using, try them out, get a sense of it, contact the developer if needed, find out what the research base is, because just because it exists and is available does not mean it is a valid app to use, and sometimes they're not that helpful. I've seen studies where they look at apps for different purposes, and I'll just paraphrase here, but there's 1,000 apps for this particular mental health purpose. Of those, only 100 have been studied, and of those, only 12 have found to be evidence-based and effective out of the 1,000. So what we naturally assume, what our supervisees assume, and what our clients assume doesn't always match reality. And then with social media, things like Facebook, for example, which many people use in their lives, it's a great way to communicate, to share, to keep in touch. There are many people who use all sorts of social networking applications, Instagram and Snapchat and all these things as ways of establishing, forming, and maintaining relationships. And therefore, they'll naturally think, oh, I can do that with my counselor, or supervisees might think, oh, I can do that with my supervisor. And these are important boundary issues. And again, in addition to an electronic communication policy, it's important to have a social media policy. Social media policy that my colleague Keely Combs has developed, that anyone's allowed to download, use, put your name on, modify. I think these are important parts of our competence in working with supervisees, with working with clients, and for helping our supervisees in their work with their clients, because everyone at some point in time is going to receive a friend request from a supervisee or a client, and just ignoring it is
not a good idea.
Not the best thing. They might have a visceral reaction to your ignoring them. So having a policy where you discuss these things up front. And again, if you wouldn't be friends with a current client or supervisee in person, why would you consider being one online? Yeah. So I would just share that these are areas that we need to be thoughtful of.
Thank you. We are so appreciative.
My pleasure. Take care.